if you look at European cities, and I'm talking from a German perspective, so I'm not saying that all of these cities in Europe function the same, but German cities are very much influenced by functional planning, right? So that's a concept from the 30s where you had to divide the factory from the houses to avoid pollution, noise, and air pollution, and so on. And so our cities are still influenced by this, right? Because that was when the streets were built and many of the buildings were built. And normally like this kind of planning was oftentimes very car centric and also focused on like commuting workers. So people who went from home to work in the morning and then came back from work to home in the evening. So very linear mobility in a way. And because these people were back in the days more men than anything else, it is a very androcentric planning, you would say. So a male-centered planning that prioritizes the needs of these commuters over other forms of mobility. But so nowadays, work has changed, work life has changed, not only since the Corona pandemic, but even more so during that time. We have like so many people who do home office now, for example, who have very different mobility patterns, right? Maybe not, they don't commute to work anymore, but they move in their neighborhoods. You have more women and young females working, so they are also doing work. You have unpaid care workers that are also so important to think about because we have never really paid attention to care work, to unpaid care work in our planning of the cities, right? And we know now that the unpaid work that oftentimes more women and girls are doing, not only, but often, it amounts to even a larger amount of GDP in our countries than the actual formalized paid work. So it's a huge amount of work that's been done there and that we don't take into account in any of our planning just because it's so invisible, right? So this is another reason why we need to look at gendered perspectives when we talk about mobility, because we have to plan for all these people and they have new needs for mobilities. We focused on the perspective of care workers because that was really interesting to us. Care work, just to give a context for this, unpaid care work is oftentimes done by women, but not only, right? And care work, what is that? That's childcare, but also caring for elderlies. It's also caring for people with maybe disabilities who move in a wheelchair. Research from the last decades shows that these care workers have very different mobility patterns than our formalized commuters. What care workers do is they have a very different pattern. They don't move linear, but they move in very complex patterns. It's a smaller area that they move in. Sometimes only the neighborhoods, maybe, but they always move, or not always, but they often move from not from A to B, but they move from A to B to Z to A to D to A to F, G, and so on. So care workers have very different mobilities, and if you want to plan for these needs, you have to take these into account. So now I come to my case study. I work in the city of Hamburg, and we work a lot in applied innovation and research projects with the city of Hamburg together. And we look at digital tools and technologies and the use of data for city planning, for urban planning. And we are working on a connected urban twin project. So we work on a digital twin of the city of Hamburg. What does this twin show us? And how can this twin help us to move into the direction of a sustainable transformation of our city? And so on. So there's a large data gap on other forms of mobilities, plus, of course, the large data gap of what is actually unpaid care work in our society, because we don't have any data on that either. So we asked ourselves, how can we build this twin that is going to be used for mobility planning if this twin cannot include these perspectives because we don't have the data? So we wanted to implement an experiment where we can collect this data, make it visible, make these topics visible, ask these people, these stakeholders of our city, these citizens, these care workers, ask them, what are your mobility patterns? What are your needs for mobility? And how can we make sure to see these when we plan for our city? And so what we did is we built two connected tools. One is a urban data collector and one is a urban data narrator. And so, yes, so we had for a couple of weeks, we had this experiment where we invited care workers to the research lab, let them map their mobility. It's not quantitative. So it's not, we cannot use this data and say, we know now that 30% of all Hamburgers, like people in Hamburg, need this or that, right? So it's very qualitative data. But it has made visible this topic, which is very important. So it has brought this to the attention of policymakers. We have so many people, we have so many different needs, and we need to include these views and these perspectives into our planning. Who is allowed on our streets, and for whom do we make space in our public space, right? So I think these are very important questions. And if I would advise EU policymakers what is important, I think it's a couple of things. The first is we have to understand care work as a system relevant work and plan for it. So this is, of course, a task for all of society and also how we are socialized in terms of gender roles and so on and so on. But it's also a policy task, right? We have to understand mobility of care as a data typology in order to address the data gaps and close them and collect data. And we also have to collect gendered data, not only gendered, but also, I think, collect data on marginalizations, on all kinds of marginalizations. This is very important because only if we can see the issues, we can also tackle them, right? And make policies in order to make this situation better. So it's very important to be aware of the topics and to see them clearly. I think what could also be a smart approach is if we allow smart and sharing mobility enterprises into our cities, and if we allow them to use our shared spaces for their business models, which we are doing at the moment, we should oblige them to plan for collective and social mobility goals, which are the goals of the policymakers, right? But which, of course, are not the goals of a company. I mean, of course not. They operate on a business plan, and that's understandable. But if they use shared spaces that are paid by taxpayers' money, then they should also engage in these spaces in a way that pays onto our goals of social and equitable societies.